Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first talk of the year organized by the Nathanson Center. We are fortunate to have Professor Chartier to speak to us today about a topic that I think I imposed on you so much because you picked something else. So I hope that's okay. I'll just give a very brief introduction, and then the podium is all his. So Professor Chartier has a JD and a PhD from UCLA and Cambridge universities. He's a professor of law and business ethics and associate dean as well. He is the author of Radicalizing Rawls, Anarchy and Legal Order, Economic Justice and Natural Law, the Science of an... you need to help me with that.
Conscience.
Exactly. And The Analogy of Love, and the co-editor of a number of books as well. He's going to talk to us today, I'll keep the introduction short, about Rawls. And I'm assuming, not having read the paper he's presenting myself today, that he's going to pose a challenge, and it's going to be a very engaging conversation. So I invite you to then, after the talk, to follow up with questions for him. Thank you so much again for doing this.
Pleasure. So thank you so much, Professor Saberi, and thank you so much to the Nathanson Center for the opportunity to have this conversation. So I want to talk, as Professor Saberi has said, just a little bit about Rawls and cosmopolitanism in the law of peoples. And as people who are interested in the conversation about Rawls and global justice will know, there is an enormous secondary literature on this topic, and I've tried to contribute to that, some in Radicalizing Rawls, which Professor Saberi mentioned. But before one even gets to that point, there's obviously the question of what Rawls himself actually says, and what I want to do here in the limited amount of time and space available, I think, is just to make the fairly modest point that he doesn't say very much. In what surely remains his most influential work, A Theory of Justice, Rawls seeks to articulate an understanding of justice that is captured in this very intuitively appealing notion of deliberation in the original position behind the veil of ignorance. Right? So Rawls invites us to imagine a number of people who are participants in a given society. He suggests perhaps they might be heads of families, deliberating in what we can envision as a sort of ongoing conversation about the shape of that society's institutions. But what's interesting about the conversation for Rawls is that, as we know, the participants don't know anything about their positions in the society whose institutions they're seeking to shape, and they're denied access to various other bits of information about the world and themselves as well. The idea we're supposed to imagine is that when people deliberate behind the veil of ignorance, when they deliberate in the original position, they're putting aside, in effect, their personal preoccupations and identities, and therefore can reason fairly about what might be appropriate for the entire society. And you might think about this as a sort of dramatic extension, imaginative extension of the basic idea that's implicit in something as morally commonplace and very helpful as the Golden Rule. So, the deliberators in the original position for Rawls are equal. They're political equals, roughly speaking, because they have, says Rawls, what he calls the two moral powers. And the details here aren't all that crucial, but the idea is that they're able to reflect critically on the principles underlying the society. If they have the capacity to engage in that sort of reflection, then they're entitled to equal participation in the discussion about what the society's institutions ought to look like. And of course, then Rawls goes on from that general procedure to elaborate a very complex account of domestic justice, justice for an individual closed society, entered only by birth, exited only by death. He begins to nuance that a bit at the end of A Theory of Justice when he starts talking about things like justice in war. But as a general matter, up until that point, he's really focused narrowly on an individual society. One of the other things, of course, he talks about in the latter portion of the book, in addition to justice in war, is global justice. What might count as the framework for what he's very early on starting to talk about as a law of peoples. He doesn't want to appear to reify the existing system of states, and so he wants to use the word people as a convenient label for something that might be a sort of more morally appealing alternative to a state, though it ends up looking pretty much the same. And he then goes on in the 1992 Amnesty Lecture and in much more detail in his 1999 book, The Law of Peoples, to lay out what his approach to global justice might look like. But it's really quite similar to what he does early on in the latter part of A Theory of Justice. And here's where the puzzlement starts for people who pay attention to Rawls's work. So again, we've got this idea at the domestic level that justice, for Rawls a property of institutions, is what happens when those institutions follow the norms embraced by people in the original position. We can imagine what it would be like for people to deliberate in the original position as political equals, and when they reach conclusions behind the veil of ignorance, at that point, those conclusions are ones that are fair and can thus reasonably be embraced by everybody in the society. So that's the domestic model. And so we might expect that when Rawls goes on to talk about what's going to happen at the global level, his basic assumption that people are equal because they can, to the extent at least, that they can reflect critically on relevant institutions, we might expect that that was precisely the same principle that would determine how norms for global justice were shaped. But, of course, Rawls surprises us, or at least surprised me, and surprised a number of other commentators, when instead he moved in a rather different direction. So instead, at the global level, deliberators in the original position are representatives not of individuals or even of family groups, they're representatives of peoples. And so where individuals are equal at the domestic level in virtue of their possessing the two moral powers, by contrast, at the global level, peoples are simply treated as equal without further ado. And perhaps not very surprisingly, this means that the norms of global justice, which are generated by the conversation that goes on in what Rawls talks about as a, quote, second original position at the global level, those norms of justice are pretty limited. And they don't look very much like the ones that are embraced at the domestic level. So, in particular, Rawls wants to suggest that for a people to be accepted into the deliberation in this second original position at the global level, what matters is that it be either a liberal people, a people that embraces something like the human rights protections that he wants to endorse at the domestic level, or, and this is really, I think, the bit of the argument that does the most work for him, or what he calls decent non-liberal people. And so decent non-liberal peoples are hard to find in the real world. That is, Rawls's own criteria for what counts as a decent non-liberal people makes it the case that he himself doesn't offer any examples, and I think given his criteria it would be difficult to find any. But what he's got in mind, roughly speaking, are societies that embrace some central human rights protections, but don't embrace the values of liberal society, are not democratic, do not necessarily respect a full range of free speech and free religion rights. I mean, people aren't persecuted because of religious differences, but there might be official religions. In fact, he says explicitly what he has in mind is a certain kind of traditional Muslim society that's embraced a full range of protections that he imagines would be accepted by such a society, but that is not liberal. That's his own example of the sort of society he has in mind. And so he recognizes that there's not necessarily a complete overlap. He knows there's not a complete overlap between what the decent non-liberal people will embrace versus what a liberal society will embrace. But he envisions, but for reasons that we can continue to speculate on, he wants these two clusters of peoples to be represented in the original position at the global level, so that whatever norms of global justice are embraced are ones that will be acceptable to those two groups. That's just part of the way he defines the global procedure. So people have been, I think, puzzled about Rawls's persistent rejection of cosmopolitanism. The question has been, why does Rawls not want to embrace the same kind of equality of persons at the global level that he does at the domestic level? That's been a key question. And as I say, there's been a great deal of ink spilled on the question what Rawls should have said. The Rawls industry is enormous, but I wanted today just to focus fairly narrowly on what Rawls does say, because I think he leaves a great deal on the table and perhaps helps to explain why the ongoing conversation among participants in the Rawls industry has been as extensive as it has been. So we find Rawls offering this defense of a people-based or state-based set of grounds for global justice and rejecting cosmopolitanism at various points in the Law of Peoples. The Law of Peoples is the last work Rawls actually finished on his own. He had serious health problems in the last few years of his life, and while he published other books, these were books that were edited by students. But the Law of Peoples he actually did manage to finish himself, and so it's his last word on the subject, but it does seem as if there might be more to be said. So here's one thing he says that seems less than conclusive. He says, advocating a cosmopolitan approach, and so here's the quote, amounts to saying that all persons are to have the equal liberal rights of citizens in a constitutional democracy. At the end of the quote. So if we start out by treating everybody as equal, then everybody will have equal rights. Okay, fair enough. And he says, this is not a quote, this is my summary, we could know that everybody should have equal rights at the global level. And this would, he thinks, mean that decent non-liberal societies don't really pass muster. They're not okay. We could think this only if we had a reasonable law of peoples already in place. So he says, just because we can envision a cosmopolitan original position at the global level doesn't demonstrate that we're left only with the liberal option at the global level, and we can't merely assume that. The problem is, though, that the very procedure that Rawls wants to propose for deriving the law of peoples seems to guarantee that decent non-liberal peoples are treated as acceptable, and that the individual equality of persons affirmed at the domestic level for liberals isn't built into the global level. It's part of the way the procedure's designed. It's not the case that somehow this is just a kind of interesting consequence of a procedure that's adopted on other grounds. Rather, he's structured the procedure in such a way that it seems like it's going to lead to this result. So he says, those deliberating at the global level are the representatives of equal peoples, and equal peoples will want to maintain this equality with each other. And so I think we can see that the rejection of cosmopolitanism is as much a consequence of the structure of the second original position as the rejection of hierarchy is of the structure of the first. Puzzling, because we find Rawls saying that the original position is designed to represent, here's a quote, what we would regard, you and I, here and now, as fair conditions under which the parties are to specify the law of peoples. Well, why do we have good reason to treat peoples as equal? That's the question, right? Why he's given us specific reasons for treating people as equal at the domestic level, but now suddenly at the global level we ought to treat peoples as equal. Why should we do that? Well, the problem is that he specifies equality among the parties in the first place in laying the groundwork for the global original position. So the global original position can't itself give us any particular reason to regard the parties as equal. It's designed to result in their equality. So for all Rawls has said, as far as we can tell, the arguments that he's given for the equality of persons at the domestic level, which seem in principle applicable at the global level, they remain as convincing as ever. Now, you might think not only that it's inconsistent with those arguments for equality, the ones that he lays out in A Theory of Justice, to start with peoples rather than people at the global level, but it might also just seem a little odd, right? So peoples, seems to me, don't have any independent reality other than, apart from the actual persons they comprise, right? The point of a theory of justice, of a liberal theory of justice, will be to foster important aspects of the well-being of real people and to safeguard them against very serious wrongs. And if their interests are in view, then it might seem fairly strange to focus institutionally, at the matter of institutional design, on peoples. So, you know, particularly given that somebody might well not regard a people, indeed even a liberal people, that asserted jurisdiction over her as treating her fairly or as entitled to represent her or enforce rules regarding her or whatever. Bottom line is that a global system that assumes the legitimacy of decent non-liberal peoples and treats peoples in general as foundational seems to beg the question against this sort of dissident and to rule out any sort of global order that is much more complex or pluralistic than the one we've actually got. So the puzzle then only deepens. So we note that Rawls makes this kind of question-begging move at the beginning, but then when he goes on further, we find that he's really still not helping us very much. So I think he just compounds the problem when he says that in the law of peoples, we view peoples as conceiving of themselves as free and equal peoples in the society of peoples. That's too many uses of the word peoples in one sentence for me. But anyway, so current global society in which peoples, or states, theoretically conceive of themselves as equals, is just treated as a given. Now, obviously, I think we all understand that there might be any number of reasons, pragmatically, right, for not disturbing that feature of the existing global order in implementing a given theory of justice. Somebody could certainly argue for that. But what Rawls is doing is not simply saying, let's acknowledge those pragmatic constraints, but he's rather saying, when we formulate the theory, let's treat that aspect of global society as given. And why would you do that unless it was theoretically necessary? Problem is, he's simply not demonstrating any kind of theoretical necessity for it. So he tells us, you know, we're waiting around with bated breath for some explanation. We're looking for answers as we work our way through the text. So he tells us Section 2 of the Law of Peoples contains a partial explanation for why his Law of Peoples is grounded in a procedure, quote, this is his own phrase, that is fair to peoples and not to individual persons. Okay? So he's clear. He acknowledges the procedure is fair to peoples but not to individual persons. And he's going to tell us in Section 2 partly why that's the case. He says, but Section 2 doesn't help very much, right? So in this section, what does Rawls actually do? He spells out the idea of a people as a group that has a shared cultural identity united by common sympathy and loyalty to a set of public institutions and norms of fairness. So we might think, I mean, we certainly don't have to debate this one way or the other here, that this set of characteristics at least helps us see why a people might matter, right? Why people might have morally relevant value, and in particular, because this is really the underlying concern here for Rawls, why liberal peoples would show appropriate regard for other peoples, both liberal and non-liberal. That's fine. But what Rawls actually says about the nature of a people serves at best to lay the groundwork for his later argument, right? So explaining what people are and why they matter is great, but that doesn't tell us why they're equal in the determination of principles of global justice, right? And certainly, it doesn't help us see why the putative interests of a people ought to trump the interests of the real persons who are the members of that people. So what Rawls says, I think, about freedom and equality at the domestic level gives us at least some reason. I mean, not a knockdown, drag-out argument, but you can see why, at any rate, Rawls would say this, that persons are morally equal quite apart from their membership in particular societies. It's not immediately clear from the way he lays things out in A Theory of Justice, but it becomes apparent that he does think that's the case, for instance, when he talks about justice in war, when it's clear that we're concerned with the relationships among people, among persons who are not participants in the same social project, kind of in the nature of the case. So Rawls' simple explanation of the nature of peoples doesn't undermine the actual argument that he gives for freedom and equality in general, or for the contention that persons shouldn't be asked to sacrifice themselves for the well-being of their societies, which is, of course, a really crucial underlying principle of his discussion of things like strains of commitment. So he tells the reader, as I've just noted, we can move on now from section 2 to section 11. So reminder now, section 2, which he says provides a partial explanation for why persons are not treated as foundational at the global level the peoples are, why we have, again, his phrase, an order of global justice that's fair to peoples but not to individual persons. He's going to tell us about this in section 2 and section 11. So in section 2, he says, well, peoples matter. Okay? Maybe something else in the book will help. So he moves us on to section 11. What does he do in section 11? In section 11, he's arguing for liberal tolerance of decent non-liberal peoples. Okay? Because, he says, because advocating a cosmopolitan approach amounts, I've quoted this already, amounts to saying that all persons are to have the equal liberal rights of citizens in a constitutional democracy. He thinks, he draws this conclusion, a cosmopolitan account of global justice would require liberal societies to seek to convert all other societies to liberalism. And he thinks that's a problem for various reasons. So we certainly shouldn't endorse that kind of requirement unless we're sure that non-liberal societies don't make the grade. And we would only know this, he says, in virtue of a reasonable law of peoples. Now, as I suggested, I think the problem with appealing to a reasonable law of peoples here is that he's already set up the reasonable law of peoples so that it yields an outcome that's disfavorable to that view. But that's not the only thing he says, fortunately, in section 11. He says some other stuff. So Rawls thinks that the considerations underlying a commitment to tolerance explain why we shouldn't treat persons as equal at the global level, right? So the argument seems to run something like this. If we treat people as equal, then they are entitled to equal rights. But if they're entitled to equal rights, then societies that don't respect those equal rights shouldn't be tolerated, and we don't want to have an international scene marked by persistent intolerance when we can avoid it. Something of that sort. So it seems like the biggest problem with this kind of claim, first of all, is that Rawls hasn't shown, I'm not saying he couldn't, and I'm not saying he shouldn't, I'm not saying we shouldn't, but Rawls hasn't shown that we have any particular reason to be tolerant in the first place. So it's not clear why we're treating tolerance in quite the foundational role that he is. So again, you might think, on his view, we need something like a law of peoples, or as I think I would prefer, a law of persons, to ground an account of global tolerance. So he can't really appeal to the value of tolerance to explain why a global law of peoples should take the form he thinks it should. But let's bracket that concern. Maybe he can address that. It seems like there are two separate elements to Rawls's concern with tolerance. Right. So first of all, we can say liberals shouldn't regard decent non-liberal societies as unjust. Why? Because doing so would be disrespectful to members of those societies. And the other thing you might say is liberals shouldn't regard decent non-liberal societies as unjust because doing so might seem to justify forcible interference with those societies. Not sure either of those carries the day in explaining or justifying the move that Rawls makes. So, first of all, I think when we're talking about the issue of respect, and Rawls gets this, but he doesn't seem to get it at quite this point. Let's suppose that being non-violently but quite directly challenged about the merits of some particular feature of one's society's institutions constitutes a blow to one's self-respect. I'm not sure that's always the case, and we can talk, and I will talk a bit more about how morally relevant that might or might not be. But suppose that's the case. One thing that it seems to me Rawls just doesn't take seriously enough here is the question, whose self-respect is at issue, right? Because it's not that there is some collective sense of self-respect that's shared by all members of the people. Rather, it seems to me, just how invested one is in the institutions of a particular society will have a great deal to do with how much one's self-respect is affected, if it is, by criticism of those institutions. And so it's going to be the dominant players in the society who are invested and whose self-respect will be most affected if those institutions are challenged, whereas it is precisely those people who are marginalized and excluded and in one way or another disfavored by the society who presumably will have much less investment there. And it's, I think, a little troubling that he doesn't seem to face that issue head on. But there are some other things we might say. So the question that I think is left open when tolerance gets talked about in this very kind of vague general way that Rawls does is just what level of respect is due to these public institutions and cultural patterns that are in various ways illiberal. Right, so again, I think you need a satisfactory theory of justice, and it seems like a requirement of tolerance is best seen as a conclusion that we might draw from a satisfactory theory of justice rather than a constraint on such a theory in Rawls' interest, right? I mean, we can imagine all kinds of moral theories in which that wouldn't be the case, but just thinking about the way this works in Rawls' theory. Now, tolerance, obviously, even if it's not there at the ground level of the theory, it might well be a demand of prudence or of justice in the real world. I certainly think it is. But to show that it would not be at the same time to show that it needed to be treated as a desideratum, right, at the global level that ruled out treating persons as fundamentally morally and politically equal. So obviously, regarding some societies' illiberal institutions as unjust, right, and criticizing those, surely that is thoroughly compatible with not humiliating those who embrace those institutions. It's compatible with not showing contempt for them. It's certainly not, it doesn't require disrespect in that kind of overt way. Now, we understand, right, Rawls continues to be himself a liberal. And so he regards illiberal institutions as in some fundamental sense illegitimate. So it's not as if he's somehow a kind of cultural relativist, as I think some readers of his later work have supposed. He's not a kind of cultural relativist. He clearly thinks that ultimately a defense can be mounted of liberal societies as preferable to illiberal ones on grounds that are not ultimately arbitrary. Now, he doesn't, I think that we can find a kind of Archimedean Kantian point from which to do that, but he certainly does think that there's something to be said about it. So he's not simply collapsing into silence when the question of comparisons can be made. He thinks we can make a distinction. And so it's a little puzzling that his own work doesn't seem even, even within the law of peoples, obviously, doesn't seem to raise some questions there. But in any event, so embracing cosmopolitanism simply doesn't have this consequence that people have to, that liberals have to act disrespectfully in the first sense that I talked about, right? Humiliating or contemptuously dismissing people. But it also doesn't have the consequence that liberals somehow should engage in military intervention or impose sanctions or whatever, use violence to constrain the design of illiberal societies, institutions. And so again, it doesn't require in any way that kind of disrespect. And so Rawls wants to say, well, we don't want to have cosmopolitanism. We don't want to have a commitment to individual equality in our conception of global justice because this leads to disrespect. But it seems as if the two obvious senses of disrespect that we might offer here, either a kind of psychological disrespect, contempt and humiliation, not necessary, or a disrespect in the sense of violent intervention, also not entailed in any way by the acceptance of a cosmopolitan account of justice at the global level. And so Rawls's own claim that cosmopolitanism leads to disrespect doesn't seem to cash out in a very plausible way. To embrace the conclusion that the institutions, some institution, let's say, of a given decent non-liberal society is unjust by Rawlsian standards, just doesn't mean treating that society as an appropriate target for invasion or sanction or anything of the sort. Somehow, this message seems to get lost in the discussion. So, for instance, Harry Gould, writing an early defense of Rawls, says that given a cosmopolitan standard of justice, quote, decent hierarchical societies are ruled out, and an entire segment of the world is dismissed as unjust. So he says a cosmopolitan standard is objectionable because it denies the acceptability and dignity of all types of societies other than our own. Okay, from the standpoint of a cosmopolitan theory of justice, right, decent hierarchical societies obviously count as unjust, right? They deny their members full social and legal equality. They decline to respect the full panoply of liberal rights, and so they fail to meet what Rawls himself thinks of as the demands of justice. Rawls doesn't think all extant regimes are just, right? So the whole point of articulating a theory of justice or a key point, is to provide a tool for evaluating the injustices of actual regimes. And so obviously he thinks that there are good reasons to offer of one kind or another for negative evaluations of illiberal regimes. It's not that he thinks we collapse into inarticulacy at this point. So whatever Rawls says about what liberals ought to say about decent non-liberal societies, he seems perfectly willing to classify an entire segment of the world as unjust. He's perfectly willing to do that. Why? Well, he spends most of the time in the Law of Peoples talking about liberal versus decent non-liberal societies, but he's got discussions of what he calls outlaw states and benevolent absolutisms, and he clearly condemns benevolent absolutisms and outlaw states as unjust, right? And I guess we can imagine that, I suppose he wants to say, well, people aren't really invested in those societies, so only the rulers are being condemned. But I think that would be a little naive on two fronts, right? On the one hand, it fails to acknowledge the degree to which there might well be popular identification with those regimes, and on the other hand, it assumes too kind of great identification with the regime in both liberal and decent non-liberal societies. So the point is, he's not objecting to wholesale dismissal by liberals as unjust of a whole range of societies, just wants not to do it in this particular case. Rawls thinks that decent non-liberal societies' institutions would be inconsistent with a cosmopolitan, that is, individuals are equal, global justice norm. I think that's almost certainly the case. He then goes on, though, to argue that judging illiberal peoples to be unjust would have negative consequences for their self-respect, and so we should not embrace this kind of principle given that. Now, it's interesting to note that this is not an argument that does anything to undermine the view that persons are equal, right? It really has more to do with whether we ought to talk about whether they are. It certainly also doesn't explain why, and this is an observation I alighted on earlier, why the self-respect of people who support the status quo in some non-liberal society, why their concern trumps the concern of people who are opponents of the status quo in that society. So if proper self-respect depends at any rate on acting morally, then maybe that helps to explain one distinction Rawls seems to make. The self-respect of the leadership of a decent non-liberal society is more morally commendable, clearly he thinks, than the behavior of those in charge of a benevolent absolutism or an outlaw state. So, maybe there's the idea that when there's some bare minimum of moral commitment on somebody's part, then that person's self-respect matters. Well, don't know, right? So you might think liberal criticism should affect the self-respect of some people in those societies, but in outlaw states or benevolent absolutisms, but this doesn't persuade Rawls that liberals should avoid criticizing them. If self-respect actually depends on acting justly, then there's no obvious reason why the self-respect of decent non-liberal peoples shouldn't be called into question to the extent that their practices and their institutions are, on Rawls's terms, unjust, right? So Rawls thinks we ought to preserve self-respect, we ought to respect self-respect, right? But at the same time, he's got the view, clearly on his own theory, that injustice is being perpetrated by institutions, by various illiberal institutions. So does self-respect depend on acting justly or not? Well, if it doesn't depend on acting justly, it's not altogether clear why we ought to be concerned about it. If it does depend on acting justly, then one wonders why it should be out of bounds to criticize illiberal and so on Rawls's terms unjust institutions. If proper self-respect depends on acting justly, then those who do act unjustly are not entitled to self-respect. So if a particular conception of justice might make some people subject to criticism, so what? That's unavoidably the case when you engage in moral discourse. So maybe the issue isn't whether decent non-liberal peoples are entitled to self-respect, whether self-respect is proper. Maybe it's just something else, right? Maybe we should just think about self-respect as a kind of natural fact, just as a matter of feeling good about oneself. And so in this case, we could say that lack of self-respect undermines agency in some ways, and we ought to be concerned about that when we think about institutional design. But hard to take this seriously, right? Self-respect in this unmoralized sense doesn't seem nearly as worth protecting as self-respect that's rooted in acting justly. But even if we thought there were something really quite important about just this self-respect as a bare natural fact, just feeling good about yourself, it still might seem to be the case that there would be a presumption that this yielded against engaging in a certain kind of criticism. But why wouldn't that criticism be defeasible, right? So just because it proved to be important not to undermine self-respect in this sense, it would not follow that not undermining it was so important that this provided a reason not to take the interests of particular persons into account, right? So you might think such and such an illiberal society features such and such an unjust institution. It's a reason not to criticize that institution, that doing so would in one way or another undermine this non-moralized kind of self-respect that people in the society have. But is that a big enough reason to avoid criticizing and challenging those institutions, given that some real people are being disadvantaged in significant ways by the institutions? And then, we could take this too far, but obviously whether I should articulate, whether I should give voice to a given kind of criticism or condemnation, right, in light of a given moral standard, that's a different question from whether the standard actually obtains, right? So just because I agree that articulating a standard in a given context might undermine somebody's self-respect, that's rather different from the question whether the standard actually is applicable. So it would be perfectly compatible, I think, with acknowledging the force of the standard to avoid engaging in certain kinds of critical behavior. But whether or not engaging in this overt critical behavior is appropriate is quite different from what the standard actually is. And so just to underscore again the point I dropped in earlier, it's really important to be clear about whose self-respect is likely to be affected here, right? So there's not some undifferentiated mass of self-respect shared throughout a society. There are the people in charge of the society, the people who are the dominant players in the society, who are most invested in that society's institutions, we may suppose, whose self-respect really is likely to be challenged in one way or another by direct criticism or challenge to those institutions. But there are the people who are the victims of those institutions whose self-respect doesn't seem likely to be adversely affected, and indeed might well be enhanced by the criticism of institutions that are attacking them. So anyway, the bottom line is, I think, that conduct that criticized the institutions and the practices of decent non-liberal societies obviously could affect the self-respect, in this non-moral sense at any rate, of those committed to upholding the status quo in those societies. But it certainly need not hamper the self-respect of those trying to foster change, and that might well be enhanced. So it just seems to me that Rawls has not shown that recognizing the liberal rights of all persons would necessarily do great harm to the reasonable self-respect of particular peoples. And I think he's failed to show convincingly why a people's interest in preserving its identity and its self-respect trumps the interests of any of its individual members in something like the full panoply of liberal rights. Rawls considers the objection. It's all kind of ad hoc, right? There's not a systematic elaboration here. But so he's got this discussion of the value of a people in section 2 and the importance of tolerance in section 11. He considers the objection that because decent non-liberal societies are not themselves egalitarian, they shouldn't be entitled to equal representation. So he envisions an objector offering a kind of straw man argument that says, well, the individual societies don't have institutions that treat people equally, so they shouldn't be treated equally. And his response to this is, well, hey, social institutions and individuals treat groups with different organizational patterns, churches or universities, for instance, as equal for certain purposes. Yeah, that's certainly right. That does happen. But rebutting one objection to the model certainly doesn't show that there's anything fundamentally sensible about this equality of persons at the global level. So another move Rawls wants to make, another thing that seems to be lurking here somewhere near the surface, is the need for allocated responsibility. So somebody needs to be responsible for particular resources if they're going to be properly taken care of. That's right, but it doesn't seem to provide much of an argument for treating states or peoples as equal at the global level, right? So the idea, of course, that he's working with is, in effect, it seems to me, some legal regime needs to be responsible for territory and resources, just like at the domestic level, we need to have particular groups or individuals responsible for particular, bits of property. So it's the equivalent of the kind of argument somebody might offer for a property system at the domestic level. And that's all well and good, but first of all, it doesn't show that at the global level, whoever needs to have allocated responsibility is a state, right? It might well be the case that individual the other kinds of institutions might be able to handle this. And let's suppose that peoples or states really are the best tools for handling legal responsibility for these various resources at the global level. Still doesn't show why they need to be treated as equal in determining the norms of global justice. And that's the point here. We also find Rawls making another kind of move that says, in effect, well, if we treat people, individual persons, as equal in moral and political standing and rights at the global level, then this is going to lead naturally to the call for a global state. So since we have good reason to not want a global state, apparently that means we have good reason not to want liberal equality at the global level. And Again here, this just seems to move too quickly through the evidence, right? So I think, yeah, I understand Rawls's point about concern with global authoritarianism, with the concentration of power. And my guess is that deliberators in a cosmopolitan original position at the global level would get the same point, right? They would understand the value of distributing power rather than concentrating it in the hands of a global state. So there would be every reason, precisely in the service of the individual rights that deliberators in a cosmopolitan original position would embrace, there would be every reason for them to not embrace an approach to things that would lead to the imposition of a world government, right? So to the extent that Rawls is rightly concerned about such a thing, it's not clear why the same considerations that appeal to him wouldn't appeal to those deliberators, and that would mean they would have reason to endorse smaller and more responsive institutions, whether those would be states or something else. So it's not clear why the considerations that matter to Rawls wouldn't matter to them, and therefore provide perfectly good reason for them not to embrace the kind of order that he's envisioning. They wouldn't somehow mandate a global state, which is what it seems like he's envisioning. So it really seems to me that ultimately Rawls offers little real argument for treating peoples rather than persons as basic at the global level. So he notes, correctly enough, right, the equality of peoples, or really states, in contemporary global society, but whether this equality ought to be preserved is exactly the question at issue, right? So he clarifies the meaning of people and tells us why peoples are valuable, but that doesn't really bolster his case. He appeals to the value of tolerance, and I think the value of tolerance is real, but I don't see why the value of tolerance is in any way incompatible with acknowledging at the foundational level, at the bedrock level, the moral and political equality of individuals at the global level. He suggests that a cosmopolitan global justice norm would be inappropriate because it would require the pursuit of policies that would, in one way or another, damage the self-respect of illiberal peoples. And he certainly undermines the claim, plausibly enough, that that intolerant regimes lose the right to be tolerated just in virtue of their intolerance, but that doesn't give us a positive reason for endorsing the view that those regimes act justly. In fact, of course, he doesn't think they do. So he rightly emphasizes that we need somebody to be responsible for resources, but he doesn't really show us that the somebody has to be a state, nor that, if it has to be a state, that means states have to be treated as foundational at the global level. He seems to think, again, that endorsing a view of persons as morally and politically equal at the global level would somehow require a world government, but he doesn't show why it would, and why the same considerations that make him not want such a world government wouldn't have the same effect on those deliberators. So the bottom line is that Rawls sees that he needs to explain what's wrong with cosmopolitanism, given its inconsistency with what he actually has to say, but his efforts to undermine it in the Law of Peoples certainly seem relatively thin. So you might have thought there was a fairly decent, not overwhelming, but decent Rawlsian case for the essential moral and political equality of all persons on the planet in virtue of their capacity to do what they can do, what makes them equal at the domestic level, namely just reflect on the principles of justice in the society. Now, so that there is certainly, leaves other questions on the table. It leaves on the table question whether there's a basis for distinguishing those who make up the population of one state from those who make up the population of another state. That's a separate question. But it still seems to be the case that somebody who recognizes that other people in her own society are her equals just because of that fundamental capacity to reflect on the principles underlying the society that Rawls talks about, if that's recognized within one's own society, it's going to be fairly difficult to not acknowledge when one encounters somebody from another society who has that same capacity, that that person is in some interesting and important sense also one's equal. And again, I think Rawls gestures at that when he talks about principles for justice in war. Rawls notes that this is obvious, right? He sees why this is a direction it would seem natural enough to go, but he rejects it, I think, without very careful, explicit consideration. He acknowledges, right, that his law of peoples is grounded in an original position at the second level that is fair to peoples and not to individual persons. But frankly, he does very little to defend this people-based starting point for reflection on global justice. He briskly rejects the global equality of persons. The arguments he offers for treating peoples or states as foundational and equal at the global level are undeveloped and insubstantial. And as my friend Fernando Tasson observes, it's hard not to see this as an ad hoc hypothesis that enables Rawls to reach the results that he has in advance decided are the most plausible for the law of nations. Even someone who is a defender of Rawls's position, Richard Miller, acknowledges his actual arguments about the difference between the domestic and the global are not an adequate justification for his anti-cosmopolitanism. Now, not arguing that nobody could come up with better arguments, as I suggested, the secondary literature telling us what Rawlsians think Rawls should have said is enormous and continues to grow. But I think it's fair to say that what Rawls himself actually says in opposing cosmopolitanism and defending his state-based approach to the global level is pretty thin and requires further development if it's to be persuasive.
Okay. Thank you so much for this interesting talk. So I guess the way we will handle this, we have about 25 minutes to stretch it to half an hour for questions. So if you just raise your hands, Professor Chartier is going to point at you, and I think this mic would need to be circulated. So
there's a couple more.
Okay, right. So if you could just introduce yourself and your affiliation before your question, that would be great.
Please.
Hi, Michael Giudice. I'm in the Department of Philosophy.
Cool.
Here at York. So enjoyed your paper, and also agree that there are all sorts of things in a law of peoples which are unsatisfying, sketchy, but no source of inspiration for others to try and pick up the Rawls industry. I mean, it's pretty good for the Rawls industry that Rawls said what he did in the law of peoples, given that there are others who think there are many other things Rawls should have said.
Yes.
But I just wanted to maybe go back to something a little bit earlier.
Sure.
That you mentioned. So I guess I agree with just about everything, maybe except for the emphasis.
Okay.
I'm not so sure that the self-respect argument based on tolerance is quite why Rawls was opposed to cosmopolitanism, as I think you are. I think the emphasis might be somewhere else. And I think I'll just try and keep it brief. It's not something that I work on, but it's something that I'm read and I'm interested in as well. But I think Rawls might have worried about something that we don't worry as much about as he did, namely the close association between human rights and armed intervention. I think for Rawls, and certainly for others such as Walzer, and certainly the history of human rights in the 20th century, especially the Declaration coming so soon after World War II, is that human rights were often conceived primarily as a trigger for armed intervention. And that was very worrisome for those in the U.S. and other places worried about Vietnam, Korean War, and other places.
Yeah.
They certainly had really big concerns about making judgments about human rights violations too strongly, given that there was such a close association with those judgments being made and the perception that intervention was then required. And World War II, I think, explained this quite well. And I wonder whether it's not a philosophical defense. I think you're quite right on the philosophical grounds. I think those arguments break down quite readily. But as a kind of causal explanation about why he might have been so opposed to making much stronger cosmopolitan arguments that would criticize non-liberal states. I think maybe he had something like that in mind. We clearly separate a human rights violation judgment or assessment from the separate issue. Well, then what do we do, not just as a global community, but as individual states? We separate that, I think, quite much more clearly than Rawls did, and I think Walzer and others in his time. I think of Alan Buchanan as a prime example. But I think his worry might have been different or stronger than our worry in that respect.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful, right? I mean, for people who know Rawls's biography, he was in the U.S. military in the Pacific during World War II, and as I recall, actually entered Japan after the atomic bomb blast there. I think he was somebody who had a real pained awareness of the horrors of war. And while I don't think what he ultimately says about the just war in the Law of Peoples is, to my way of thinking, altogether satisfactory, and I don't say what I'm about to say in a dismissive way at all, his heart was in the right place. I think he got that there was a real problem. And I think that concern with war, which again manifests itself in the context of what he says in A Theory of Justice, where he's clearly wrestling with the challenges not just of war in the abstract, but of young people he was, I'm sure, engaging with, who were asking what they did about involvement in Vietnam and so forth. Clearly he's worried about this. And it strikes me as very plausible that he wants to articulate an approach that will include a kind of prophylactic against easy intervention. I don't know, obviously, what's going on, in his, the inner sanctum of his thoughts here, but what you're saying as a causal explanation strikes me as really plausible. I don't know if you want to go further with that, but I agree with you, certainly. I don't think we have to go down that route, right? I mean, I think we can, as you suggest, make a distinction there, but it may well be that, for him, the two just seemed so closely connected that it was difficult to do that.
If I could just follow briefly.
Please.
One way which you could explain that is to see his work in the Law of Peoples as kind of a transitional work. While we're still grappling with that tight association of thinking of human rights as necessarily as triggers for intervention, the work could be explained in that way. It's sort of a manifestation of that growing pain, trying to get around that view.
Yeah, makes sense. Please. Oh, okay. You both at the same
there
time.
somebody else?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, I didn't see you when I saw
Sasson, PhD candidate, Osgoode Hall here.
Yeah.
This is, I guess, a question that I've been wrestling with over the past couple of months, so if it comes across, if I'm missing something, please do fill it in. I'm wondering how much of Rawls's focus on the law of peoples as between peoples and peoples is shaped by his idea of what international law is as being relations among states rather than, so sovereignty as autonomy rather than sovereignty as political exercise of political power within a geographical limit. And that's, I guess, more of the international sovereignty arguments, international politics is coming in right now, where people are arguing, well, there are limits on autonomy of states, or there should be limits on autonomy in states, whereas he probably thought that autonomy is absolute, and it's the equivalent to sovereignty, and if you're going to have a law, you're going to have a law among nations, rather than a law that mediates what people internationally can do within nations, or should be treated like within nations.
I mean, I don't think he thinks autonomy is absolute, right? So he's quite prepared to allow for, I think despite the considerations we were just talking about, I think he's quite prepared to allow for some infringements on the autonomy of outlaw states in particular, which he envisions as engaged in programs of attack on their neighbors. But I suspect that even benevolent absolutisms he's going to think of as maybe in some cases ripe for some kinds of interference. I'm not sure how much. But I think fundamentally, it feels to me at least as if this is the case. I mean, it's just not really well developed. He spent so much of his time on this, and the industry has grown so much focused on this toward the end of his life that it's unfortunate that it's just less well developed than it might be. But it really feels to me, both when he discusses this as early as he does in A Theory of Justice, but then all the way, 3 decades later almost in The Law of Peoples, he is still presupposing that equality of peoples or states at the global level because it's a presupposition of current international law. Now he wants, by talking about peoples, I think he wants to nuance talk about autonomy or sovereignty. He wants to say there are moral limits on what can happen in given societies. But he still wants to treat that as a foundational element, to treat that equality as a foundational element, which seems to just be derived from existing international law norms, right? So, as you'll know, in Rawls's later work in political liberalism and so forth, there's much more the idea of justifying norms of justice on the basis that they can be extracted from, kind of an existing political culture. And you might think that that's what's going on at the global level here, except that that's not what he's doing, at least in any obvious way. He's certainly not defending it that way at the domestic level. Now, maybe he is doing the same thing at the domestic level, and again, this fruit for the, fodder for the Rawls industry there. But yeah, he's just got this idea that we just kind of take the international system as a given and tweak it. We can improve it, but its fundamental features are not open, it seems like, to revision. And I genuinely find that kind of puzzling. And Hengame, you're going to help me with that. Mm-hmm.
Thanks so much. This is very interesting. And this is coming from somebody who hasn't explored Rawls before The Law of Peoples, beyond that so much and beyond just the theory of justice. So if there is more in there that I don't know, I would need your help to clarify that. But I just wanted to go back to the idea of self-respect. And also to say that just following up on the question before last, that if we were to salvage what we could salvage from The Law of Peoples, basically looking at the intention, the cause, the worry of Rawls at the time, and also this was just simultaneous. It was coincidental that this was published around the same time of after Kosovo, right? So that's just coincidence. But just it fit in so much. It was received so well at the time, maybe because of its timing of the publication. But if we were to expand what could be salvaged, then going back to the idea of self-respect. Would it be plausible to think that there could be something more philosophical at work here that Rawls might have covered at some point on respect, or might not, just trying to find it elsewhere? That if self-respect is associated with shame as well on the other side, then and also making it a bit broader, just connecting it to the idea of self-determination as well, right, in a larger sense. Then shame is not only for what we don't change, right? So it's not only because of, so if you take shame basically resulting from some sort of deviation, sometimes social or moral, so there is deviation that the agent would want to change but cannot, or the deviation that the agent is unaware of, or the deviation that the agent just does not want to change, right? And so if you take the version that part of it that the agent would want to change something but is unable to, and in the political context, coming from decent societies, citizens who would want to change and they are not co-opted either, but they just don't have the self-determination capacity, then wouldn't you think that then self-respect becomes more important, right? So because in the way, at least I took it from what you the way you divided the two categories is people who would want to keep the status quo, people who would want to change it, right? And it seems that we owe a higher obligation to those who would want to change it, but there might be an obligation to those who would want to change it but don't have that self-determination capacity yet.
Okay, so let me just engage with you a little about that. I just want to get a clearer sense of how you're thinking the argument might work. So we imagine a society which features institutions that we'll just accept arguendo are unjust for one reason or another, okay? And there are people in the society who are not sufficiently influential that they're able to effect change in those institutions. And in fact, their self-respect perhaps is hampered precisely because they lack that capacity to change institutions which adversely affect them or people they care about. And so we might think that in their case, criticism from outside the society, challenge of one sort or another, nonviolent challenge of one sort or another from outside the society, might actually bolster their self-respect. But what you're suggesting, I'm asking, not asserting here, but are you suggesting something like, well, external criticism underscores for them the reality that they lack the capacity to make change they might want to, and thus, ironically, might serve to undermine their self-respect rather than bolstering it?
Absolutely.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. So I don't think that's an unreasonable observation at all. And it seems to me that it might be the case that what I intend as helpful affirmation of those engaged in a certain kind of struggle within a society other than my own might be experienced by them as pitying and paternalistic and just leave them feeling, just reminded of their own kind of lack of agency. So I think that seems perfectly right. That could happen in a particular case, and would certainly be something that we ought to avoid. Again, I guess I would wonder, and I'm happy for you to respond on this front, whether two things, I guess. First of all, surely that's going to be a very situation-specific inquiry. It's not going to rule out any and all external challenge and criticism. But also, right, it's one thing to ask, what are the applicable norms of global justice? And another question to ask, how should I go about promoting those? And so Rawls appears, and this goes back to our exchange earlier, to be kind of running those questions together so that once I decide that something is a norm of global justice, then somehow that means that all the stops are out and I just do whatever I can to promote it. But one surely could imagine a situation in which I said, yeah, this institution is unjust, but I need, for just the sort of reason you've you've articulated, to be very circumspect in what I do about that, right? How would you think about that?
I have to think about this more, but
Okay.
then would you, are you inclined to suggest then at that point there is a cost-benefit analysis as to what could be sacrificed or not, or no? That's how would you?
Well, I think there's a cost-benefit analysis as regards when it's appropriate for me, what kind of strategy I use to promote a given norm. That's, if you want to think about Sam Scheffler's distinction between promoting and respecting values, I guess it may not actually be Scheffler, but I owe it to him. So you might think, there's a requirement of justice in place. I don't get to perform a cost-benefit analysis in determining what that requirement is or whether I respect it, but when the question is, am I going to focus resources on promoting that, then I certainly might want to think, yeah, but there are real costs, there are real values that are implicated here in my attempt to promote this that I want to take seriously and that I don't want to undermine, by promoting it in this case. I don't think that's different in principle from the sort of argument that you might want to give, right, about intervention, right, that military intervention, there are fantasy worlds, right, in which military intervention is costless and targeted and all goes well. We don't live in that world. And so even if you think that an intervention actually is consistent with a bunch of specific just war norms in terms of respect for non-combatants and so forth, and I think we all know that's not going to be the case, but even if you could imagine a situation in which it were, there might be a range of other costs that would dispose you to think this is a really bad idea to encourage or promote, and we ought to have an institutional framework that discourages that. Same thing, it seems to me, as regards nonviolent engagement. You might well think this is the right thing to do given that all these other consequences aren't occurring, but given the likelihood of these consequences, it might well be a good reason to to shut up. You know? Yeah, please.
Hi,
We need to get you a mic, I think.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Hi, I'm Brian. I'm a first-year student here at Osgoode.
Cool.
So I was wondering, you mentioned if we do accept a cosmopolitan account of international justice, and there's many good reasons too. You said military intervention is not necessary, but you'd think there are some things that would be necessary if we did accept such a norm. And so, off the top of my head, one thing seems to be, like, for instance, knocking down immigration barriers. So if we're from a liberal country, however you want to define that, and you see a bunch of people living in a regime that doesn't respect their rights much, you'd think unlimited immigration from that country to the liberal country would be something that it's almost a bare minimum of someone espousing a cosmopolitan theory of justice. So I was just wondering what you thought, and maybe some other suggestions on things we could do.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really useful and provocative example, and obviously it deserves a paper of its own to really talk through all the issues there. But yeah, in radicalizing Rawls, I do try to talk about that cluster of issues, and one of the things I say is precisely what you've said, that I think a cosmopolitan law of peoples would, it seems to me, entail free migration. And we can argue about that, and it's clearly not a position Rawls would have taken. But yeah, I think that's important. If we look at the range of things that the governments of putatively liberal societies in the West do right now that, let's put it gently, complicate the lives of people elsewhere around the world, I think we could begin to identify a number of things that probably would be on the agenda of cosmopolitan deliberators in a global original position. So I think immigration restrictions, certainly to my mind, would count among those. But also, let's think about some other things. Think about the way in which there's been such a long history of imperial meddling in countries around the world on such a consistent basis by the dominant powers. I tend to know things that the Americans and the Brits have done better than some other miscreants, but I think we could come up with examples from other societies as well. But so from my side of the border, let's pick on the Americans. Think about everything from sending the Marines to Nicaragua, to overthrowing Mossadegh in Iran, to fomenting a coup in the Dominican Republic, and so forth. So if you think about that range of aggressive manipulation that's consistently undermined institutions elsewhere, that matters. If you think about the way in which trade barriers have so clearly been structured to the disadvantage of non-dominant players, right? I mean, think about the way in which, again, from my side of the border, I see this, and I don't propose to comment on details here that I don't know about, but the way in which agricultural subsidies and agricultural trade barriers persistently benefit well-connected corporations in the U.S. to the detriment of both consumers in the U.S. but also producers, in poor countries who could otherwise be competing on an equal footing there. I think cosmopolitan deliberators would have a lot to work with, even if things like intervention were off the table. Yeah, please.
I'm Daniel. I'm an MA student in philosophy.
Cool.
Just have a question about the way representation works at the second
Yeah.
order level of
Yeah.
the original position.
Mm-hmm.
So at the first order level, you have persons deliberating about persons under the veil of
Or at
ignorance,
any
or
rate,
certain-
theads of families deliberating about persons.
Right.
Yeah.
Whereas at the second level, you have persons deliberating about peoples. And
Yeah.
it just seems to me that there's a kind of a psychological transposition from the individual level or the domestic level to the international level.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering how, in Rawls, I don't know if he elaborates on this at all,
Mm-hmm.
how strong is that analogy between the individual and the state or the peoples? And it just seems like a state or a peoples seems to me to be more heterological
Sure.
than an individual. And I'm just wondering, if the analogy falls apart?
Well, I mean, I think it does. I can't think of a case in which Rawls talks about the psychological issue there, because, of course, he's not imagining that we actually put anybody in this position. He simply invites us imaginatively to think our way into it, to strip away certain features of our current situation and reach some conclusions about fair institutions. I think there would obviously be much greater psychological tension there, but yeah, I can't think of a case where he really gets at that.
Thanks.
Anybody else?
Okay.
Cool.
There are no more questions. Thank you so much. Let's just give a round of thank you.